Swapan Dasgupta, welcome to Hard Talk. More than 3 years ago, when he came to power, Mr. Modi was described widely around the world and in India, I think, as a conservative, a Hindu nationalist, and a populist politician. Do you think he's lived up to those labels?
Well, I think the most important thing about Mr. Modi when he came to power is that he was interpreted very differently by very different sections of the electorate. There were certainly some who saw him as a conservative. There were some who saw him as a free marketer. Others saw him as a nationalist. Some saw him as a poor man, poor boy made good. And some people saw him as a member of the backward castes. So it really depends. Mr. Modi conveyed multiple images to people. Now, which one is really the real Mr. Modi? I think he's all of them. In some ways.
Which one would you... I'm very taken in your writing, and of course you're an ally of Mr. Modi and the BJP has put you in the upper house of the Indian Parliament, but you're also a writer, and I'm very struck by some things you've written. For example, you said, for too long Indian conservatism has been at the receiving end of condescension and caricature, and the Modi government has substantially negated the importance of entitlement, as though you see Modi as an anti-elitist.
Well, I think in the United States, you call it outside the Beltway. I think Beltway is really the time. In India, we call it the Lutyens mob. And that's really a set of people, perhaps privileged, perhaps English-speaking like me.
I must say, in parentheses, you are part of this establishment.
I would say I'm one of the orphans of Macaulay, if you might call it that way. People who exactly saw themselves as very entitled. And people whose aspirations centered on the Congress and the Gandhi family to a very large extent, and they epitomized that ecosystem. Mr. Modi was an unknown entity. Mr. Modi was not a Delhi politician. Mr. Modi came from the provinces. He was a provincial chief minister. He was, in fact, ostracized and hounded for a lot of his views. He was treated as a complete outsider, outlander, in fact.
Yeah, but the more you talk, the more I am hearing the echoes, the resonances of the Trump phenomenon in America.
Mr. Trump came after Mr. Modi. So I think...
Okay. Let's not argue too much about the chronologies, but in terms of the spirit of a man, let's remember Trump's phrase, what was it? He was going to go to Washington and drain the swamp. So you're suggesting to me that for you, that's what the last 3 years have been about?
That's only one part of it. A change of the elites. Not really a dispossession, but a relative marginalization of some of those who hitherto occupied preeminent positions. But that's only one aspect of it. I think what is really important about Mr. Modi is that after 25 years, India got a government with a full majority. And that meant a prime minister didn't have to look over his shoulder when taking decisions. And Mr. Modi came with a track record of being decisive, of being firm, of having a clear mind of what he wants to do. He is controversial. I would say he is polarizing, but that's not necessarily pejorative terms.
Well, we'll get to the polarizing when it comes to some of the sectarian and communal issues in India in just a moment. But actually, I want to begin by taking on board what you've just said about him coming to power, attracting the outsiders in India, and suggesting to you that those who are most outside are the poorest in India. And when one looks at the delivery in terms of poverty alleviation and eradication in India in the last 3 years, frankly, it seems to me that Mr. Modi has been found wanting. He's achieved a lot in economic terms, but he hasn't fundamentally shifted that block of Indians, some 250 million, who are living on or below the poverty line.
I think Mr. Modi has done a tremendous amount to actually, the most important, try and make India a modern economy. I think what's important is that the impulses which were reflected during the election were that people wanted opportunities. They were exasperated with having to live a shoddy, plodding life, and they wanted to get ahead. And the most important thing which Mr. Modi has done in the 3 years, and I would say the number one issue, is a frontal assault on corruption. One of those things which was really holding India back. The image of India, plus the sheer venality, the inefficiencies which got into the system, I think Mr. Modi has done tremendous
Believe me,
work.
I'm going to ask you about corruption, but I want to stick with the poor and what Modiism, if there is such a thing, is doing for them. I'm very struck.
I would say to the poor, the most important thing which he's done for the poor is that previously government welfare payments were siphoned off at a very large way. Today, using technology, using a certain determination to get ahead, you have managed to have direct payments.
But
you've opened the banking system to the poor. You've opened quite a lot of...
But look at the record. Look at the record, Mr. Dasgupta. In Gujarat, when he was chief minister, and today as prime minister of the nation, his record is actually of cutting benefits, cutting welfare, doing a lot for the rich in terms of favourable tax policy, doing a lot for corporate India, but actually doing very little for the poor, particularly in the rural areas. And I am so struck by the fact that a former BJP, his own party, a former BJP finance minister, Yashwant Sinha, is currently on a protest with poor farmers in Maharashtra state saying, quote, "Private investment is shrinking, industrial production has all but collapsed, agriculture is in deep distress, the construction industry is in the doldrums." He says our economy is in crisis.
If our economy was in that much of a crisis, we wouldn't have registered growth rates of the level we've had. If our economy was in crisis...
I'm not saying corporate India is in crisis. I'm not saying that the middle and upper middle class aren't doing very well.
I'm saying that if our economy was indeed in that sort of a dire condition, as you make it out to be sometimes, or Mr. Yashwant Sinha makes it out to be, you would not have had repeated electoral successes for the BJP. You would not have had an entire revolution which has resulted in women's empowerment to a very, very significant extent. You would not have had electrification of villages, which has taken place in a tremendous sort of way, which has changed and altered the lives, the quality of people's lives. Where I think Mr. Modi...
Just like Mr. Trump in the United States, those who are most keen on the economic reforms delivered by Mr. Modi are the corporates and the rich. That is just a fact in India today. Because they're benefiting and they're doing very well.
I think some of the corporates are resentful of the fact that the cronyism which marked some of the earlier business practices have been done away with, that corporate lending has been streamlined, that corporates who haven't paid back money are being punished. I think it's also there that the discretionary powers, which some corporates believed was their route to success, has been done away with. I think there is far greater rule-based system, which is good for some people. It is good for corporates who don't have connections. Yes. It may not be necessarily good for the corporates who have hitherto used political access.
I'm tempted to rely on the word of people who make a specialism out of studying corruption in developing economies. Transparency International are one such group. Their most recent report, March of this year, India still has the highest bribery rate amongst the 16 Asia-Pacific countries that they surveyed, and nearly 7 in 10 Indians who had accessed public services said that they had had to pay a bribe. That's this year.
Yes, I think that's quite true, that there is bribery, that is still rampant. But what is important is two things. One, that at the top layers of government, corruption has more or less completely ceased. The powers of discretion, which were really at the heart of corruption, that's come down. Number two, tax compliance, which was really one of those dodgy areas of India. People just didn't pay taxes, and a very small number of people. Can you imagine that in 2 years, we've had something like an additional 7.8 million people now paying taxes? It's not because there's been a certain windfall, they've won the lottery or something like that. It's a greater sense of compliance. A lot of the resistance which has been coming in is because you are putting in more people into the tax dragon.
May I say, for a writer who's converted himself into a politician, you are doing an extremely good job of putting a positive spin on everything Modi's doing. But there are other spins to be had, and some of them come from inside his own party. This is a former BJP minister, Arun Shuri, talking about the so-called demonetization policy, where overnight Mr. Modi declared that the high-denomination banknotes were going to be taken out of circulation. He said it was to get rid of black money, all of that corrupt money that was swilling around under people's beds and elsewhere in India. But actually, the effect has been to legitimize a lot of black money that has simply been moved into the banking system and is now regarded as perfectly legitimate. Now, this Mr. Shourie describes it, quote, as the world's largest money laundering scheme.
Well, Mr. Shourie has a way with words, and both the critics of Mr. Modi you've quoted were people who were...
He's got a real point, hasn't he?
He does not have a point.
Mr. Chidambaram, I interviewed him not so long ago. He says it's the biggest scam of 2016.
Mr. Chidambaram may have it. What has happened is that you had 90% of the demonetized money coming back into the banks, number one.
Now regarded as legitimate,
no,
however
it's not
dirty
legitimate.
it was.
It's not legitimate anymore because that money now has an address. Next step is for them to account for that money. It's the second step which has been very conveniently left out. Just because money is deposited into the banks doesn't make it legitimate. Had that been the case, we wouldn't have had money laundering operations. It's done through normal banking operations. I think what is very important is that the critics of Mr. Modi were struck by one thing, the sheer audacity of this decision. Something which takes into account 86% of the cash which was in circulation in India was demonetized. It affected every single Indian. I don't think there's rich, poor, was affected by this decision. Why was it endorsed? Why? Everyone suffered personal inconvenience in some way or the other, some more, some less. But there was a certain determination on the part of people that, look, the cancer has gone too far. Perhaps you needed a dose of very drastic surgery. And I think demonetization, it hasn't ended corruption. But
for sure
it hasn't. I would say that. But it's a very major step in that direction. Now take that, read it along with other legislation which has come along the way. And I think for the first time what India has done is that the wheels of corruption were just growing. It was just rolling. And now you've actually managed to roll back the tide for the first time.
Interesting.
And I think that, to my mind, is very important.
Interesting that you couch it in terms of the audacity and the decisiveness of Mr. Modi. Why hasn't he been equally decisive and firm when it comes to smacking down hard on what we see from the outside as the dangerous rise of communal, sectarian hate and violence in the India of Narendra Modi?
Well, I think Mr. Modi has been quite clear in his mind, in his own personal interventions, that he sees these issues as a complete distraction from the main task, which is to build the economy, take India to the road of progress. In this first independent...
When people are being killed because of their beliefs,
yes.
Because, for example, a Muslim man happens to own a cow, and some people down the street believe that he has slaughtered a cow, he is murdered for that.
There have been hate crimes in India, and I would say that constitutes a hate crime.
That's not what Mr. Modi has ever said.
Mr. Modi may not have said it. Mr. Modi has said there is he called for a 10-year moratorium on any contentious issue.
Mr. Modi on Twitter is seen to follow people who peddle hate and who celebrate when a Muslim young man is murdered because he's falsely accused of slaughtering a cow. We all follow lots of people on Twitter just to get a diversity of opinion. He's the Prime Minister of India. Is that not irresponsible?
I mean, he follows me. I
suspect you do not declare celebration when a Muslim man is killed in that fashion.
No, certainly not. Look, in India, we have all shades of opinion. Some of them are ugly. And I think I would be the first to admit that there are certain people who believe that Mr. Modi's victory also symbolized their liberation from what they see as the scourge of secularism and avenge history. Now, there are these people.
Avenge history.
Yes, there are people.
You surely know more than anybody else that Mr. Modi is seen by Muslims in India and many outside as a man who still has a cloud hanging over him because of what happened in Gujarat in 2002. You know that there are still serious allegations about his role as chief minister in riots which killed many, many hundreds of Muslims. Given that past, given that past, surely your advice to him, and you do speak to him, is to be as tough as he can possibly be on what you call hate crimes, but that is a phrase he does not use.
No, he does not use.
Do you think he should?
I think what Mr. Modi has to do is to make sure that the political agenda moves decisively away from these sectarian issues. That the political agenda is focused principally on the question of development, and that identity politics of such a narrow variety actually ceases. Now, how you do it is really the question.
Forgive me for interrupting, it's rude, but it is so important, this. I just wanted to air the figures. There's a phrase that's developed in India over the last few years called cow vigilantism.
Yes. It is a problem. It is a real serious problem.
And look at the figures. I've looked at the last 7 years. 97% of the incidents of this cow vigilantism, which has resulted in violence, sometimes the deaths of people seen to believed to have slaughtered these animals. 97% of the cases reported under Modi's government, and most of them in BJP areas. So the party has a problem, Mr. Modi has a problem, and it doesn't seem to be being addressed.
I think what's very important to realize is that vigilantism is completely unacceptable. It has been made so, it has been declared. Various chief ministers, party functionaries have said so. Whether individuals take the law into their own hands, they must be dealt with. However, I would also emphasize one thing, that beef is one of the most emotive issues, which in India, it's got to be handled with kid gloves. There's a lot of sensitivities which are involved there, and I think you've got to play that issue very, very delicately.
That a little bit. Are you saying to me that you defend the right of Indian states to categorically ban the slaughter of cattle, not just for Hindus, or not just to make it a voluntary faith-based requirement, but to actually say to every single citizen of the state, you cannot kill and therefore eat beef?
Such legislation exists.
I know. Are you saying
that? And most of the legislation was not passed by the BJP. It was passed by previous Congress governments. That's a part of the Constitution, which also says that it is part of the duty of the people, of the government, to protect the cow. Now, you might find this antediluvian, you might find this contrary to certain customs here, but in India, as I said...
Well, with respect, it doesn't matter what I think. Nobody cares what I think, but people in India think...
Beef is a very sensitive issue in India. And I think personal tastes sometimes, just like prohibition, temperance, why are so many things, why are so few states against alcohol consumption? They've actually enacted laws against it. Sometimes they don't work. That's a different matter altogether. But there are these sort of taboos, there are these social restrictions which are there in India, and they have to be handled with a great deal of sensitivity.
It's Mr. Modi and his background and his tone. Let me end this particular point by quoting to you the words of Gandhi himself from 1947. The Hindu religion, he said, prohibited cow slaughter for the Hindus, not for the world. The religious prohibition came from within, and any imposition from without meant compulsion, and such compulsion was repugnant to religion.
Mr. Gandhi certainly was one of those greatest advocates of anti-cow slaughter.
But his point was that we must not make this ruling for everybody.
He must not make it voluntary. There are states which allow cow slaughter to take place. I think also there has to be a greater degree of realization and accommodation on the part of people to say, look, this is what I do, but this is not necessarily what you do.
Are you worried?
And I'm saying that this is a social issue. It goes far beyond politics, but at the same time, I think it's very, very important to emphasize that beef is a very sensitive issue.
Well,
it's a very part of that Indian culture. It's a part of Indian culture.
Let's leave beef to one side for a moment and just end with this thought about whether you are concerned that under Mr. Modi there is something happening with Hindu extremism. I'm now thinking of the recent murder of a journalist who spent a lot of time researching and talking about the dangers of Hindu extremism, Gauri Lanka. She was brutally murdered in September 2017. Are you worried that there is something happening in India today which Mr. Modi and his team are not capable or indeed willing to combat?
I knew Gauri very well. She was a colleague at various points. I don't think there's anything as yet to link her murder with that of Hindu extremists. I think it's one of those really grim tragedies that happen, that attack and murder of Gauri Lanka.
You see no link to her
As
writings?
of yet, there could be. I said there could be. I'm saying that, however, I think the important thing is to realize, to isolate these Hindu extremists as much as possible. Most of them, incidentally, operate outside the boundaries of the BJP. They find the BJP too moderate an organization. They believe in a very extreme, radical, exclusivist view of society, which goes against the beliefs and the sensitivities of most other people.
But why is
Mr.
your
Modi,
party, the party you're loyal to, so keen to offer SOPs to these people? For example, in the education system, one can look at states like Maharashtra, where efforts are being made to completely change the textbooks that your school children are seeing and reading, to write out whole swathes of Mughal Muslim history. Why is that happening?
History in India is a very contested issue. I think it's important to also recognize that history has been written in one particular way. It was written earlier by the colonial masters. Subsequently, at various times, there's been an influence of the left on history. And I think there is
One Indian critic of what is happening said we may soon have the absurd situation where students in Maharashtra will not be allowed to know who built the Taj Mahal.
That is silly. I think that's a caricature. That's not what is happening. There have been certain extreme cases of some people saying, oh, the Taj Mahal shouldn't be, but I think they'll be laughed out of court. What is important is to recognize that India had a certain contested history. Now, how we find a method of actually accommodating these various conflicts is really the challenge. It's an intellectual challenge. It's a challenge for historians. But to say that we should go by the earlier version of what constituted history, I think is wrong.
There's no question that Mr. Modi is very popular. I mean, he's won regional state elections in the last few months by resounding margins. His opinion poll ratings are very high. Do you also, as a man who's a writer and an explorer of India's social affairs, do you also have worries about what Modiism is doing to India?
If you think that Modi's success, his popularity, is due to a certain vision of India which is ugly, which is monstrous, which is exclusivist, I think you're wrong. There have been certain very, very fundamental changes in India. There have been a lot of actual government, a government which is seen to work at the grassroots, which is there. That is what really caps it. The rhetoric, his personal charm, his eloquence, etc., those are just the garnishing. The real substance comes from the fact that after a long time we've got a government which is perceived to be relatively honest, which is committed, which delivers.
We have to end there, but Swapan Dasgupta, thank you for being on Hardtalk.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.